They say the devil never sleeps in Scotland and in the mist-covered hills of Galloway. That saying feels closer to truth than myth. The story begins with one man, Alexander Sawney Bean. According to legend, he wasn't born a monster, but he became one by choice. A man who rejected work, law, and community, who looked at the rules of his time and decided none of them applied to him. Sawney Bean was said to have been born in East Lothian sometime during the reign of King James VI, into a world where superstition was law and the gallows were busy. He grew up poor, unmotivated, and violent by nature. He found work as a hedger and ditcher, but his lazy temper and hatred for authority made him abandon that life quickly. Instead, he ran away with a woman just as cruel as himself, a woman who shared his contempt for humanity. Together, they walked away from civilization, seeking isolation on Scotland's rugged western coast. It was there, along the jagged cliffs of Benane Head, that they found the cave. Locals said the entrance could only be reached at low tide. It stretched deep into the black belly of the rock, half a mile inward, twisting and branching like a maze. When storms rolled over the sea, waves thundered through the entrance, echoing like the growl of some enormous beast. The couple decided it was perfect, a natural fortress, hidden from prying eyes. No one in their right mind would stumble upon it. Inside that cave, Sawney Bean's twisted kingdom began. At first, they lived like outlaws, stealing from travelers, robbing the occasional cart or merchant. But soon the crimes escalated. The sea offered no crops, the hills no farmland, and the world no forgiveness. They turned to something easier, something darker. They began killing the travelers they robbed, and when food ran short, they began eating them. The first kill, the story goes, was a simple ambush, a lone man on the coastal road. They struck him down, dragged his body into the cave, and carved him open with crude knives. What began as desperation became ritual. Sawney Bean and his wife learned to salt the meat, dry it in the shadows, and store it for the lean months. They collected bones like trophies and tossed the remains into the surf. In time, the family grew. Children were born in the darkness, then grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. The Bean clan expanded through incest, growing into a tribe of nearly 50 people. Each new generation knew only one way of life: murder and consumption. They never farmed, never traded, never saw a town. Their only contact with the outside world was through the screams of their victims. Every night, the clan crept out of the cave like wolves. They ambushed travelers, entire families, and groups of merchants passing between Ayr and Glasgow. They used crude weapons, clubs, knives, and stolen swords. No one was spared. Once dead, the bodies were taken apart, piece by piece, in the torchlight of that foul cave. The meat was stripped, salted, and stored. The bones were thrown into the sea or piled deep in the tunnels. Over the years, so many remains drifted ashore that local fishermen began finding severed limbs tangled in their nets. As the disappearances grew, fear took root in the nearby villages. Travelers vanished without a trace, horses returned riderless, and wagons were found overturned, their cargo gone. People whispered of monsters or witches. Some believed the devil himself haunted the coast. The authorities blamed highway robbers or wild animals. But when search parties ventured too far west, they never returned. The road near Benane Head became cursed ground. Meanwhile, inside the cave, the clan lived in a gruesome form of comfort. They built rough furniture from bones, stored human remains in piles, and raised their children to hunt. The younger ones learned to lure travelers by imitating cries for help or distress on the road. The cave reeked of blood and smoke, and the walls were said to glisten with fat. Each generation grew more savage and less human. They had never seen daylight for long, never spoken to outsiders, never known shame. To them, the world beyond their cave was just a source of meat. The horror went unnoticed for nearly 25 years. The legend claims their body count reached over 1,000 people. Imagine that, 1,000 lives gone, swallowed by the sea in the dark. Families vanished on their way to market. Entire groups of merchants disappeared without explanation. Panic grew so intense that trade routes shifted inland. Travelers began riding in armed convoys, but even then, the Bean clan struck at night, dragging people off the road before their screams could carry. It was said the end came by chance. One night, a man and his wife were returning from a fair, riding along the cursed road when the clan attacked. They pulled the woman from her horse first. Before they could drag her away, her husband fought back fiercely, swinging his sword and pistol with desperation. As the struggle raged, a group of travelers happened to pass by. The Bean clan, caught off guard, fled into the darkness, leaving behind the mutilated woman and one of their weapons. The survivors carried the wounded man to the nearest town, where his story spread like wildfire. When King James VI heard of the attack, he personally led a search with 400 men, packs of bloodhounds, and local trackers. For days, they scoured the hills, following the stench of decay until the dogs caught a scent that led them to Benenhead. The tide was low, revealing a dark opening in the cliffs. The soldiers entered, torches in hand, and what they found was beyond comprehension. Inside the cave were rows of drying limbs hanging from the walls, barrels filled with preserved flesh, heaps of bones and skulls scattered like driftwood. The stench was overwhelming, thick and oily. The torchlight flickered over sleeping figures, men, women, and children, all pale, filthy, and wide-eyed. They hissed and clawed when the soldiers advanced. The king's men dragged them out into daylight for the first time in their lives. Every member of the Bean clan was captured. Sawney, his wife, their children, and grandchildren. None showed remorse. When questioned, they confessed to everything. They saw no wrong in their actions. Human life to them was no different from game in the forest. Their punishment was swift. The men were executed by dismemberment, hands and feet cut off before being left to bleed to death. The women and children were burned alive before their eyes. The king ordered every trace of them erased from the earth. The story spread across Scotland like wildfire, printed in pamphlets and retold in taverns. Whether every detail was true or not, it didn't matter. It became part of Scottish folklore, a nightmare dressed in history. Some historians later argued the tale was exaggerated or even invented as propaganda against the Scots by the English press. Others believed there was some truth buried in it, perhaps a real band of killers whose crimes were twisted by rumor into legend. But one thing is certain, the story of Sawney Bean struck a nerve that still shivers through time. It plays on something older than politics or myth. The fear of what happens when humanity turns its back on itself. The cave still exists on that lonely coast, and even today, locals claim you can feel a strange chill near its entrance. When the tide rolls out and the wind howls through the rocks, it sounds almost like whispers echoing from the dark. That's the kind of horror no ghost story can match. If you enjoy learning about real historical nightmares like this one, remember to like the video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Belmoze because this is only the beginning of the darkness we're about to explore. Along the rocky coastline of Galloway, where the sea hammers the cliffs like a living beast, there lies a wound in the earth, a cave so deep and hidden that even sunlight seems afraid to enter it. This was the heart of the Sawney Bean legend. To the world above, it was nothing but a dark hole in the stone, a feature of the tide-worn coast. But inside that cave, beneath the roar of waves and the weight of centuries, a family of monsters built their empire. The entrance could only be reached at low tide, a narrow slit in the rocks half hidden by seaweed and mist. From there, it stretched inward for more than a mile, twisting and branching into pitch-black tunnels slick with salt and decay. The air reeked of brine and old blood. The sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness, steady as a heartbeat. For Sawney Bean and his clan, this cave was more than shelter. It was protection, and it was power. The tide that closed the entrance each night acted like a lock. When the sea rose, no one could enter or escape. It sealed the Bean family inside their fortress of stone, where the sound of waves drowned out screams. To anyone passing along the cliffs, the cave was invisible, and even if they heard something in the distance, a muffled cry or the clash of metal, the tide erased all trace of it by morning. The sea became their accomplice, washing away footprints, blood, and bones. The Bean family arranged their home with grim efficiency. Deeper inside the cave, they carved out areas for sleeping, for butchering, for storing their grisly supplies. Torches made from animal fat flickered along the walls, casting warped shadows on piles of stolen goods, jewelry, coins, bits of clothing stripped from their victims. The deeper chambers were where the true horror lived. These were the butcher rooms. This was where bodies were cut apart, drained, and salted for storage. They hung the meat from hooks or laid it out across flat rocks, drying it in the smoky heat of their torches. Whatever they couldn't eat, they preserved for later. Some accounts say they used barrels filled with salt water to cure the flesh. Others claim they smoked it over fires built from driftwood and bones. The air inside was thick with the iron smell of blood and the acrid sting of smoke. The younger children of the clan grew up playing among piles of bones, treating human limbs as toys. The walls of the cave glistened from years of oil, fat, and moisture. It was not a home, it was a slaughterhouse carved into the earth, hidden from the reach of law or mercy. At the back of the main chamber, there was said to be a pit, a kind of natural hollow where they dumped unwanted remains. The tide crept in through cracks in the rock and carried away what was left: bones, hair, scraps of clothing. On stormy nights, waves would surge into the cave, washing through the tunnels and sweeping their filth out to sea. By morning, the evidence was gone. The water made the cave self-cleaning, like some dark miracle of nature. That's why no one suspected for decades that such horror was happening right beneath their feet. Imagine what it must have been like for anyone unlucky enough to stumble upon that place. A traveler, caught by nightfall on the road between Ayr and Ballantrae, might hear the sea below and decide to take shelter among the rocks. They'd see nothing, just the glint of wet stone. Then a voice might call from the darkness, pleading for help, a trick the younger members of the clan had perfected. When the traveler followed the sound, they'd be grabbed, dragged inside, and the tide would close in behind them. The sea would swallow the echo of their cries. The Bean clan lived like this for over 2 decades, using the cave's isolation to erase their tracks. No smoke rose from a chimney, no footprints led to the entrance. Even the smell of decay was hidden by the salt wind. The surrounding hills were empty, dotted only with sheep and heather. The nearest villages were miles away, and the locals had long learned to avoid the coast after sunset. For them, the cave might as well have been a doorway to hell. Every night, under cover of darkness, the clan emerged from their hiding place to hunt. They moved in groups, sometimes as many as 20 or 30 strong, armed with crude weapons. They attacked travelers on the lonely roads, tearing them from their horses or wagons, killing them swiftly, then hauling the bodies back through the tides. The older members led the hunts, while the younger ones carried torches or baskets for the remains. Once inside, they divided the spoils: food, clothes, gold, flesh. The women of the clan skinned and prepared the bodies, while the men cleaned the weapons. Nothing was wasted. It's said that their cave echoed with laughter during the feasts. Laughter that didn't sound human. They sang, they drank, they celebrated each kill as if it were a festival. In the flickering torchlight, the walls appeared to move with the shadows of dozens of figures, their faces smeared with blood, their eyes wild. To them, this was life, the only life they knew. The children, born in darkness, never saw a sunrise, never heard a church bell, never spoke to an outsider. They learned to swim in the cold, black water, to follow the tide, to hunt in silence. The cave shaped them as much as they shaped it. Over time, the Bean clan's lair became almost mythical in its secrecy. Some said they had built traps at the entrance, spikes or nets to catch intruders. Others claimed the walls were covered in carvings, crude symbols, prayers, or curses scratched into the stone by candlelight. But one thing was certain: the cave became a living thing, a part of their identity. It fed them, protected them, and kept their crimes hidden. The tide was their shield. When reports of disappearances grew too frequent, the local authorities searched the coast but found nothing. They didn't think to look inside the rock itself, and when body parts began washing ashore, bloated and pale, people blamed shipwrecks or sea monsters. The truth was too terrible to imagine that the missing travelers were being eaten by an entire family living beneath the cliffs. The sea eventually turned against them. One stormy season, bones began to drift out faster than the tide could hide them. Fishermen pulled up nets tangled with human remains, hands, skulls, half-rotted torsos. The waves had started returning what the Beans had tried to hide. When news reached King James VI, it was said he didn't believe it at first. Cannibalism on such a scale seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The cave had begun to betray its masters. By then, the Bean clan had grown complacent. They believed themselves untouchable. They trusted the tide to keep their secret. But that very isolation, that deep dark home, became their undoing. When soldiers and bloodhounds finally came, led by the stench of rot and the whispers of survivors, the cave no longer offered escape. The tide that once hid them now trapped them inside. The Cave of Carnage, as it later came to be called, still exists. Visitors say the air around Benane Head feels heavy, that the sea seems quieter there, as if holding its breath. When the tide goes out, You can still see the narrow opening between the rocks, the same gap that once swallowed hundreds of lives. Some claim you can hear faint sounds from within the drip of water, the echo of waves, and something else, something softer, like voices murmuring deep below the surface. It's said that if you stand there long enough, the wind carries a smell, salt, smoke, and something coppery. That cave wasn't just a hiding place. It was the perfect accomplice, a natural accomplice to murder. It kept the family safe, erased their crimes, and turned the endless hunger of the sea into their shield. It's a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters don't live in castles or forests. They live under our feet, waiting for the tide to come in. When night fell along the Scottish coast, the roads that wound through Galloway turned into a graveyard waiting to happen. Travelers knew the danger. The moors were wide and lonely, and the sea's voice was louder than any cry for help. Most who vanished were simply marked down as lost-rubbed, killed by bandits, or drowned by the treacherous tides. No one imagined that an entire family was feeding on them in secret. The Sawney Bean clan didn't just hunt for gold or food. They hunted for flesh. They turned human beings into meat. The attacks followed a pattern. The family would wait near the narrow paths that hugged the cliffs, where travelers had no place to run. Sometimes they worked in pairs, other times in packs. The older men carried clubs and long knives. The women carried baskets to collect what was left. When a rider approached, the family moved fast, emerging from the heather-like wolves. They'd pull the victim from their horse, silence them with a blow to the head, and drag the body toward the rocks before anyone could hear. The sound of the tide covered everything. Horses bolted, wagons tipped, torches were extinguished. Within minutes, the road was empty again. Once the victims were brought inside the cave, the horror began in earnest. The family knew their trade well. They had practiced it for decades. Sawney Bean himself, the patriarch, directed the work with cold precision. He treated it like a craft, a ritual. The bodies were stripped, their belongings sorted into piles, gold and valuables in one, clothing in another. Then the flesh was prepared. The eldest daughters handled the cutting using long, sharp blades that had been stolen from travelers or forged from scavenged metal. They carved the meat in silence, slicing along the muscle as if butchering an animal. The youngest children watched and learned, their wide eyes catching the flicker of the torches. The air inside the cave was always heavy with the same mixture of smells: salt, blood, smoke, and something sour that never went away. They used the same flat rocks for slaughter again and again. The surface was stained a permanent dark color. Sometimes, when the tide came in and filled the lower chambers, the waves would wash over the stones, carrying thin trails of blood into the sea. But the sea always gave something back: bones, scraps, bits of hair. It was as though the ocean itself rejected what it had been fed. For the beans, eating human flesh became their normal life. It was no longer monstrous in their minds, it was simply food. They roasted it, boiled it, salted it, even pickled it in jars of brine. The meat from the younger victims was said to be softer, while the flesh of older men was tougher and often smoked over the fires that burned night and day at the heart of their lair. The children were raised on this diet from birth. They didn't know bread or fruit or ale, only the taste of salt and iron. They grew up strong, with pale skin and yellowed eyes that reflected the torchlight. Some accounts claimed they would feast together in long gatherings that resembled banquets. The family would sit on furs and driftwood, tearing at the cooked flesh with their hands while the cave echoed with laughter. The younger ones danced around the fires, their shadows jumping across the walls like restless spirits. The older ones toasted their kills with stolen wine. In a twisted sense, it was their version of community, their family dinner. No prayer, no remorse, only hunger satisfied. Outside the cave, the world noticed the pattern, but not the cause. Travelers vanished along the same stretch of road, sometimes entire groups disappearing without a trace. The locals whispered of monsters, witches, or demons. Farmers found bits of bones near the waterline, gnawed clean. Horses were discovered wandering the moors, reins cut, saddles missing. But there were no suspects, no clues. The disappearances were too far apart, too random. The Bean family had perfected their system of hunting and hiding. The coastal tides were their greatest ally. When the moon was full, they planned their attacks around the rhythm of the water. The men would scout from the cliffs during the day, tracking caravans or lone riders. At dusk, when the tide receded, the family would strike and vanish back into the cave before the sea returned to cover their tracks. By the time dawn broke, their victims were nothing more than a memory. Bones burned, blood washed away, and valuables sorted for the next trade or feast. Once or twice, a survivor escaped. There are stories of one woman who fled the beans after her husband was killed, running barefoot across the rocks while the tide chased her. She was found days later by a patrol, half mad with fear, her clothes torn and her hands cut from climbing the cliffs. She spoke of torches in the darkness, of laughing voices, and of faces pale as ghosts. Her story spread like wildfire through the nearby villages, but few believed it. Cannibalism was unthinkable. The idea that a whole family, men, women, and children, were living underground and eating human flesh was too grotesque to accept. It was easier to blame bandits or wild beasts. But the proof was there, washing up on the beaches after storms. Fishermen pulled up their nets and found bones tangled in the ropes, skulls, ribs, fingers. Some had teeth marks. The sea had become a messenger, delivering evidence no one wanted to see. Even so, the disappearances continued. The Bean clan grew bolder. They began attacking larger groups, even mounted soldiers. They took horses, weapons, and supplies, retreating into their cave before anyone could organize a proper search. Each new victim added to their stores, not just of food, but of stolen wealth. They collected gold, jewelry, and silver goblets from the dead, stacking them in the far corners of the cave where the torchlight couldn't reach. By then, the family had lived underground so long that daylight burned their eyes. They had become true creatures of the dark. The unthinkable menu that sustained them wasn't born of desperation. It was born of habit. Cannibalism was their culture, their inheritance. Each generation learned it as part of life. The older women taught the younger how to cure and store meat, how to cut away the bones cleanly, how to boil the flesh so it would last through winter. Sawney Bean ruled over this ritual with authority, believing himself chosen by fate to live outside the laws of men. In his mind, the people who walked the roads were not humans, but prey. The more they killed, the more fearless they became. Some say Sawney kept a tally scratched into the cave wall. Hundreds of marks representing the number of victims. Others claim he stopped counting after the first few years. To him, it no longer mattered. Death had become his trade. The bodies, the bones, the endless procession of nameless travelers, all part of a monstrous cycle that sustained his bloodline. The surrounding villages became ghost towns after sunset. Fires were lit early, doors barred, and prayers whispered. Mothers warned their children not to wander too close to the cliffs. Some said they could see movement along the ridges at night, figures watching from the shadows, eyes reflecting the moonlight. The local innkeepers stopped renting rooms to lone travelers. Even the highwaymen avoided that part of the coast. It was cursed ground, and everyone knew it, though no one dared to say why. The unthinkable truth remained hidden in that mile-deep cave, buried beneath layers of rock, salt, and fear. For 25 years, the Sawney Bean clan turned human beings into their daily bread. All while living only a few miles from the civilized world, the tide kept their secret, washing clean the blood that stained the shore. But secrets like that don't stay buried forever. Eventually, something changed. One mistake, one survivor, one witness who would bring the truth into the light. But before that happened, the Beans lived like shadows, ruling their own hidden kingdom beneath the earth. Theirs was a world built on hunger, fear, and flesh, a place where human life was currency, and every tide brought new prey to the table. It wasn't just murder. It was the rhythm of their existence, the way the sea fed the land, and how monsters learned to live among us. When dawn broke over the Scottish coastline, a thick mist rolled across the cliffs, swallowing everything in its path. Beneath the jagged stone and howling wind, a small unit of men rode out under royal command, their torches flickering in the fog. At their head, mounted on a white horse, was the man believed to have ordered the hunt himself, King James VI. He had heard stories for months, maybe even years, of travelers vanishing near the Ayrshire coast. Merchants, pilgrims, farmers, even entire families seemed to disappear without a trace. At first, the crown blamed wild animals or thieves, but the pattern had become too clear. Something darker was happening, and it was happening somewhere near Benainhead. It began with one survivor. A merchant half-dead stumbled into a nearby village after being ambushed on the road. He spoke of a group of attackers who came from the cliffs at night. His wife had been taken, dragged screaming into the darkness. while he managed to escape by sheer luck. His story would have been dismissed as delirium if not for the blood that covered his clothes. When villagers and soldiers followed the tracks the next morning, they found strange footprints leading toward the Seand, a trail that ended abruptly at the mouth of a cave. No one wanted to go inside. The cave was narrow at first, with water lapping at the entrance and the smell of rot seeping out with the tide. The men built torches from driftwood and rags, and as they stepped inside, the sound of dripping water echoed like distant footsteps. The tide had receded, and what they found within would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in Scottish history. The cave stretched deep into the earth, twisting like a serpent's gut. At first, the walls were slick with salt and algae, but as they went deeper, the walls changed. Smoke stains blackened the stone where fires had burned. The air grew warm and close. There were signs of life makeshift beds, animal skins, clay pots, and racks hung with strips of meat that glistened in the torchlight. But the men soon realized the awful truth. This was not animal flesh. The first skeleton was found near a pile of firewood, its skull split open cleanly by a blade. Then came more bones, stacked neatly like firewood, ribs gnawed to splinters, skulls cracked apart for marrow. Some were half preserved, hanging from hooks or stuffed into alcoves like trophies. Human limbs, salted and dried, lay beside piles of gold, jewelry, and clothing stripped from victims. Every inch of the chamber told the same story, a story of murder, dismemberment, and consumption. The soldiers gagged. Some dropped their torches. The king himself, if the tale is to be believed, turned pale at the sight. They pressed on through the narrow tunnels, finding chamber after chamber filled with more of the same. Children's bones, skulls with teeth marks, a cooking pit ringed with bones and charred wood. It was NT, just a den of thieves. It was a butcher's shop built on human lives. In one chamber, they found the remains of what looked like a crude family dwelling. There were piles of straw, blankets made from stitched hides, crude tools, and carved utensils. This was where they had lived. There were signs of children's small footprints in the dirt. Little bone charms hung on strings. It became clear that this was not a passing group of killers, but a self-sustaining clan that had lived, bred, and killed within the cave for decades. By now, the men knew who they were dealing with, Sawney Bean and his family. The name had become whispered legend in the villages nearby, though few believed the rumors until that day. According to the surviving records and retellings, Alexander Sawney Bean had fled society years before, taking with him a woman as wicked as he was. Together, they had raised a brood in the cave's sons' daughters and grandchildren, an entire bloodline born of incest, secrecy, and violence. They had survived by preying on travelers, ambushing them in the dark, and dragging their bodies back to this lair. The search party split into groups and moved deeper, finding hidden tunnels that led to underwater exits and ventilation shafts. The structure of the cave had kept them invisible for years. At high tide, the water rose to seal the entrance completely, hiding every trace of human habitation. When the tide fell, the family emerged to hunt. Their victims never had a chance. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became, a stench of decay and smoke, so thick it clung to their clothes. The torches flickered against walls, blackened with soot, revealing carvings scratched into the rock. Some looked like crude tally marks. Others were distorted faces, perhaps drawn by the clan's younger members. It was as though the cave itself had absorbed their madness. When they finally found the living members of the Bean clan, it happened suddenly. A child's cry echoed through the tunnel, followed by a rush of movement. Men shouted and fired muskets into the dark. The torchlight caught faces pale, wild, feral. The Bean family fought with knives, clubs, and stones. They were thin, filthy, their eyes adjusted to the dark, their hair long and matted. It took hours to capture them all. Some tried to flee through the back tunnels, but the soldiers had already blocked the exits. One by one, the cannibals were dragged out into the daylight for the first time in years. Outside the cave, the soldiers built fires and laid out the evidence. Hundreds of bones, barrels of preserved meat, jewelry from dozens of missing travelers. The villagers who gathered to watch were struck silent. The truth was worse than anyone had imagined. For decades, people had vanished without a trace, and all the while, this hidden family had been living beneath their feet. Feasting on their flesh, King James ordered an immediate execution. Some accounts say the entire clan was taken to Edinburgh. Others claim the king had them executed on the spot to prevent panic. Either way, Justice came swiftly and brutally. The men were said to have been dismembered alive, their wives and daughters burned before their eyes. It was vengeance meant to cleanse the land of their evil. As the tide rose again, the cave that had sheltered them filled with seawater, washing away the last traces of their crimes. But those who entered it never forgot what they saw: the piles of bones, the reek of human fat, the eerie silence once the screams were gone. Even now, locals say that when the tide goes out at Benane Head, the wind that rushes through the rocks carries with it the echo of those who died there. It's hard to separate fact from legend in this story. Some historians argue that Sawney Bean never existed, that the tale was born from fear and folklore. But whether or not the King's men truly found that cave, the story still stands as a grim reflection of what isolation and desperation can breed. In a dark corner of the Scottish coast, something monstrous took root for decades. It remained hidden in plain sight, feeding on the world above. The story of Sawney Bean ends the only way it ever could, with fire, fear, and the kind of justice that left no room for mercy. When the royal men dragged the clan out from the darkness of their cave, the sunlight hit their faces for the first time in years. They flinched like wild animals, their skin pale as bone, their eyes yellowed and furious. The soldiers who captured them said they had never seen anything like it. These weren't people who had simply turned to crime, they were something else entirely, something that had forgotten how to be human. The Bean clan numbered close to 50 by then: men, women, and children. They had lived underground so long that some could barely speak in full sentences. Their language was broken, their teeth filed, their fingernails grown into claws. The youngest among them were born into that darkness and knew no other world but blood and salt. When the king's soldiers bound them in chains and marched them toward Edinburgh, the crowd that gathered was said to have fallen silent. Mothers held their children close. Men crossed themselves. Some wept openly, not for pity, but from shock that such creatures had lived among them all this time. The legend says that King James VI did not bother with a trial. The crimes were too great, the evidence too overwhelming. The decision was instant and final execution for every last one of them. The Bean clan, stripped of their cave and their secrecy, were about to face the full judgment of civilization. There would be no hiding behind excuses of hunger or isolation. What they had done went beyond survival. It was evil in its rawest form, the kind of horror that demanded a punishment just as savage. The method of execution has been described in more than one way, but every version shares the same spirit retribution that mirrored their crimes. The men of the clan were said to have their limbs hacked off one by one, their blood spraying across the cobblestones as the crowd roared. Each scream was met with cheers. They were burned, mutilated, and left to die slowly, the same way they had done to their victims. The women and children were forced to watch. Once the men's bodies were reduced to ruin, the women were tied to stakes and set on fire. Some cried, others laughed, like madwomen, as the flames climbed higher. The youngest members of the clan, those too small to understand what was happening, were said to have been thrown into the fire as well burned alive, their screams echoing off the castle walls. Whether every detail of this account is true or not hardly matters anymore. What mattered to the people watching was the message. Civilization had struck back. The darkness that had fed on travelers and haunted the roads had finally been dragged into the light and destroyed. In a world still ruled by superstition and fear, this was more than an execution, it was an exorcism. For days after, the smell of smoke hung over the city. The cave where they had lived was sealed by order of the crown. Some said it was cursed, others that it still reeked of blood, even after the tide washed through. The villagers nearby refused to go near it. Shepherds claimed that at night, strange sounds rose from beneath the cliffs, the cries of the damned, echoing from the tunnels where the family once feasted. Even now, locals avoid that stretch of coast after dark. The story of Sawney Bean spread across Scotland like wildfire. It was told in taverns, whispered around fires, printed in pamphlets, and passed down from parent to child. The details shifted over time. Some said there were hundreds of victims, others thousands. Some swore that the Beans cooked their victims in stews, while others said they dried them like meat for the winter. But the heart of the story stayed the same: a family of cannibals, living in secret, hunting the innocent, and paying for their sins with a punishment so brutal it burned itself into history. Historians have tried for centuries to find proof that the beans actually existed. Records from the reign of James VI don't mention them directly, which has led some to believe the tale was invented later. Some suggest it was English propaganda meant to paint the Scots as barbaric during a time of tension between the two kingdoms. Others think the story grew from real disappearances, murders, and robberies that were blamed on a mythical clan to make sense of them. But even if the beans were never real, the story spoke to something real in the minds of the people who told it. In the Scottish imagination, the wilderness has always held a kind of threat. The moors, the cliffs, the dark forests, these were the places where the rules of the civilized world broke down. The Sawney Bean story turned that fear into flesh. It asked what happens when a family rejects every law of man and God, when they turn inward, away from society, and become something primal. The idea that such evil could grow unnoticed in the cracks of the land was a warning that stuck. Centuries later, the legend still refuses to die. Writers, painters, and filmmakers have all retold it, each finding new horror in the idea of the beans' hidden world. Some versions make them ghouls, others wild men driven mad by famine. But every version circles the same truth, that people are more frightened by what hides beneath their own world than by any monster from myth. The beans were not ghosts or demons, they were human, and that's what makes their story so terrifying. If you ever stand on the coast near Benane Head, the wind still cuts through the cliffs like a knife. The cave is still there, half hidden by the tide, its mouth wide and dark. When the waves crash against the rocks, they sound almost like voices. Some say it's just the sea, others aren't so sure. The locals call it the Devil's Cave, and they'll tell you that if you listen long enough, you can hear the echo of chains and the faint crackle of fire. There's something timeless about the story of Sawney Bean. It's the fear that no matter how far civilization spreads, the wilderness is always waiting at the edge. The beans lived outside the laws of men, feeding on them both literally and symbolically. When they were destroyed, it wasn't just revenge, it was a reminder, a warning carved into folklore that evil doesn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it's born right beside us, hiding in the dark until someone drags it into the light. So whether Sawney Bean was ever real or not, his name has earned a place among Scotland's darkest legends. It's a story told for hundreds of years to remind people what happens when humanity forgets itself, when hunger turns to cruelty, when isolation becomes madness, and when monsters don't need claws or fangs, they just need a reason. And if you've made it this far into the story, it means you've walked through every shadow of that cave with me. You've heard the whispers, felt the chill, and seen what became of those who dared to live beyond mercy. So before you go, take a moment to breathe again, to step back into the light. And if you want to hear more stories like this, one dark, strange, and carved from the corners of history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze, because in this world, the line between folklore and fact is thinner than you think.